My name is Cory Parnell. I'm a principal at BGM, and I'm going to be hosting this webinar. One thing is this is an interactive webinar, so if you have any questions, there's the ability for you to post it. And then as we're going along, if it's something that we'll be answering later in the presentation, it'll be deferred, but if it's something applicable at the time, John or Larry will address it. So again, just wanted to be an interactive webinar, and hopefully you gain some golden nuggets out of this. The other thing is we will be recording this and sending it out. And post it on our website and social media. So if you want to forward it on or share it with anybody, that'd be great. Or for individuals that weren't able to attend for various reasons, we will forward that on to there. Today's guest speakers are Leary Gates, who leads the market development growth strategy for a lot of different business lines. You know, for the last 30 years, he's advised Fortune 100s, startups, host of middle market tech, manufacturing, and service firms on market and corporate development. Very excited to hear his kind of background and experience in this area. Joining him is his partner, John Moroney. John's a master at helping companies create their sales recipe for predictable and scalable growth, whether a business startup or a transformation. He's managed and served as a sales leader in enterprises, software companies, led manufacturing operations in mid-tech, as well as semiconductors. Again, looking forward to this conversation. I guess the first thing I wanted to kind of start out was the title. How do we get here? And, you know, it's not exactly clear what we're really talking about. And I know originally the title you had S-curve in there. So maybe you can kick us off and just talk about that S-curve.
Yeah. So I admit the title might be a little bit odd because it is kind of implying that what you've been relying on is not going to necessarily get you to where you need to go. And it's another way of saying that the very success that you have been experiencing in growing your business may be the thing that blinds you to the new success that you have to. And that is to embrace this idea of an S curve. And I think we're all familiar with the standard sigmoid curve, where things start slowly, you ramp up as you get into your growth phase, and then at some point in time you reach a tipping point. I have a degree in physics, so this is basic physics back to, you know, the second law of thermodynamics. It says everything eventually moves to the state of disequilibrium. And so while we can expect that we're growing our businesses and doing well with it, we should also expect, even in the high growth phase of a business, that at some point in time that's going to have diminishing returns. And so the whole point of this conversation is, how do we equip ourselves to be thinking about what that next inflection point is, so that we can always, as leaders, as strategic leaders of our business, be at the forefront of that.
Yeah. Can you talk about, you know, the growth plateau? And again, the S curve, I thought you meant like a sales curve, like all of a sudden it grew and then it curved down. That's actually what I had thought. But can you talk about the growth plateau that, you know, no one even warns you about it? And why do you think so many businesses experience periods where growth suddenly slows down, or even years of strong performance?
Yeah. So as I think about it, there's kind of there's three kind of mental models that you can have, if you will, mental paradigms that you can have about how you grow your business. And the first is, usually when you're starting out, you're usually using this paradigm, and it's the paradigm of optimization. Like, all we're looking for is, where can we find some revenue? You know, give me some sales love, right, John? Where can we get some traction? And then once you move out of that has a very short S curve, because you can't be opportunistic for too long. Eventually, you eat yourself, or you run out of ideas. Eventually, you pick a lane. And once you pick a lane, then you're saying, okay, now we've got a market, we've got an offering that's starting to generate some traction. Let's double down on that. Let's milk that out. When you've made that decision, you now have moved into a second paradigm of growth thinking, and that is optimization. And optimization is basically, accountants look at optimization numbers, right? Like, what did we do the last quarter, the last year? How does that compare? All those things are when you set your growth objectives. Oh, we want to grow by 5% over last year. We want to have better present penetration of this product. We want a lot of what we do. I would submit to you that maybe 95%, it might even be more. But let me make up a statistic that's been never validated. Lots of our decisions, most all of our decisions are optimization decisions. They're how do we improve upon what we got already? And that's all well and good. And that works really well while you're going up to the top of the S curve. But eventually, optimization only can take you so far. You can only optimize so much within the markets you've got, the constraints of the way you structured your business models, your offerings, all those things. You can only optimize to a point. And then you start hitting diminishing returns. And that's when you start reaching the top of that S curve. And the point that I think John and I are really helping companies with is not how do you get better in optimizing, but what do you do when you reach the top of that S curve? That's when you need a different way of thinking. And that's when you need to think transformationally about your business. And so you've got three kind of models of thinking about growth. You could be opportunistic, you can be optimizing, and you can be transforming. And what we do, John and I, and a few others on our team, we help businesses that need that transformation. There's plenty of consultants out there that can help with growing and scaling and driving a business forward and making things do well at optimizing. Where we help them is when they need to do a transition and figure out, all right, there's probably a market that has better value for us. There's probably offerings that we could serve at a higher price. There's probably different ways we can construct our revenue engine.
And the tricky part is to know when it is that you've hit the top of the S curve.
Exactly right.
So I think that, that's a hard thing for business leaders to recognize, because as you go through your growth phase, you're invariably going to have a few bumps. And perhaps, this year wasn't as good as last year, or was just a little bit better. We didn't grow as much, or we just kind of paused. Is that because we really have hit the top? Typically not. Maybe you're going to make some changes, pricing changes, staffing changes, leadership changes, and that turns out to give you another leg, and it turns out you take some actions and you get good results, and now you're back on a growth curve. Sometimes it's market related, so it doesn't almost matter what you did. It's just as long as you hung around long enough to be able to keep going once the economy or the market started to go. So I think most business leaders have had those situations along the way, have taken actions, seemed to get good results, got back onto a growth curve. But there's a point in time typically where that doesn't work anymore. And then it's sort of like, what do I do now?
Yeah, you're onto that, right, John. The key is detecting it at the right time. Because if you try to pivot your business to a new S curve too early, you get organ rejection. It's hard for the team doesn't know what the why is to do it. But if you wait too long, you've already descended on the other side of the S curve, and then it's really, really hard because you're trying to keep a business going that's faltering and possibly failing at the time when you need to be investing energy into getting into a new S curve. So getting at the front end of that curve is the sweet spot of looking at making transformational change like we're talking about.
And
So
to
I,
play
I
off of
take it.
Larry, I'll just kind of go on what Larry's saying there. You may lose some of the key people you need in order for you to be able to
That's
take that next step, because
that's right.
they feel like, yeah, this thing's kind of run out of gas, or I'm kind of on the backside. I think it's time for me to go look. Or perhaps even the leader or leadership doesn't want to face up to that, and they're going to lose some really important people.
Yeah. It's usually the best people that leave first.
Yeah, and I guess I think about our organization, and we have multiple service lines, so I'm assuming we have multiple S curves going on in all service lines, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what are warning signs or red flags that like leadership should be watching for to see if we're hitting that growth plateau?
Yeah. So that's a great question, because here's the reality of it. And as John was pointing out, if you take the idea that we're habitualized to think about optimizing our business, that's just the habit of thought. That's what we do because that's what we're used to doing. If you take that and you combine it with the fact that at some point in time that doesn't work anymore, getting to the question you just asked, which is like, what are the indicators that are the early signs where that could be happening, is key. And clearly, there's some external indicators of that. Like you're starting to see your revenue slowing, despite increasing effort. Maybe you're putting more resources at it, and it's still not showing traction. You might Sales cycle times are probably getting longer. You might have more discounting. You have repeat businesses going down. John, you could throw in a few more, I'm sure.
Customer churn, you might see margins start to shrink because you're basically having to discount in order to be able to win business or retain business. Those would be kind of typical things that we've seen.
Some of the more
Okay.
insidious ones really are inside of the owner. When we've seen and helped businesses that need this transformational change, nearly consistently the owner already is feeling it in their gut. They're already feeling fatigued by it. They're like, it's taking more effort to make more happen. And I just don't know how long I can continue on doing this. And in some ways, some of the owners were feeling like I beat my head against a wall. We worked last year, actually 2 years ago, with a firm down in Texas, and the owner was expressing that right away. I mean, that was like he just felt like this is so fatiguing. He's just worn out, and he knew that it was time for a transformational change. So he hired us to help him put together the strategy to do that. And after we had done that, and we kind of relaunched a new brand for him that very targeted. He told me, he says, I got energy for this business again. This is like very exciting. So that's what happens when when you're at the bottom of the S curve, is when you have most of the energy. It's like you're learning something new. There's a lot of excitement. That's why people are drawn to startups, because it's like, hey, there's a lot of fun. There's a lot of death there too, but there's a lot of fun with it. When you get to the top of the S curve, that's where you see it in fatigue, because the organization itself and maybe even the owner is expressing it.
I would add that perhaps you've already tried all the usual things that you went through when you were going through some of those bumps on the growth. Maybe you changed your sales leadership because you thought it was a sales problem. Or maybe you changed some of your service leader because of that. Maybe you've changed some of your pricing. The levers, the knobs that you would have turned in the past that would get you back onto that slope, they're not working. And you've tried them all. And it's like, I'm out. I don't know what else to try.
Yeah, and there's also external things too. Like if you had a competitor that came in that was very disruptive, that brought in a new business model, new way of doing things, and you're not able to adapt to that, that's a sign that it's time. You may have reached the top of your S curve.
Um, Earlier in the conversation, you talked about the growth plateau or just a momentary setback. I mean, I'm trying to even think of like a setback. And I don't know if it's been economic times that caused that, or can you talk about how do you know the difference, or how do you feel the difference?
Well, sometimes
Between,
when you,
go ahead,
sorry,
John.
I was going to say sometimes what we kind of minimize the externalities, but often you could have a very good business model that's been very successful, but the reality is the customer set that you've been selling to and servicing is going through a disruption. And you don't have any control over that, but you're going to feel the implications of that. So if you have a set of customers that are being disrupted because of new technology or new business models to them, you're going to end up being a victim to whatever happens to those organizations. So I would say that sometimes it isn't anything to do with the fact that you're doing something wrong. It's just that the external factors are coming into play, and you got to be prepared for them. And I think Larry kind of mentioned the competitor. I mean, I would be looking at competitors to see what they're doing and how they're reacting. Sometimes a weaker competitor will start to falter before you in the market space as it kind of runs out of gas. Now, you're well run. That's great. You're doing well. Too bad for those guys. But they're a little bit, they could be a little bit of the canary in the coal mine to what's going on in your market.
And I think a key issue that comes up and why this is so challenging, I think, for leaders is it's really, really hard to detect whether you're at the top of your S curve or if you're just getting a momentary kind of bump or a blip or a dip, because even going up the S curve, that's not a smooth ride. There's going to be quarters or whatever. Like you said, Corey, there are going to be times where there's going to be some economic downturns and things like that. An economic downturn that affects your business doesn't necessarily mean you need to jump to a new S curve. It could just mean that you need to readapt to that environment in the model that you're already in. What we're talking about is when it's so insidious that you've stopped looking at whether there might be a better market with a better value somewhere else. And I just recently wrote an article. Are you confusing familiarity with fit? And the idea is, I think we can get so comfortable in the markets that we serve that we forget that what's most important is how well we fit with those markets. And because markets evolve, it could be that there's other markets out there that we're not as familiar with, but are actually a better fit for us to go to. And that's a transformational change that you need to look at as a business owner.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what can leaders do better enable them to spot when they be nearing the top of their growth curve?
I would say, and I'm going to give you an actual real world example that I lived through. Sometimes you need to get a third party to look at what's going on in terms of your business and or your market. So back in 2000 timeframe, I was leading a sales organization. We developed a product that got us into a new market segment, and we were doing really well. And we were actually growing. It was a big part of our growth for that period of time. But then we had a recession, and we were selling this to these mid-size contract manufacturers, make-to-order kind of manufacturing companies. All of a sudden, we weren't getting any business. It was like, what happened? Was it us? And we built a whole business model on a budget around getting a certain percentage of this business that was bigger than the year before, and all of a sudden we got nothing. What's happening here? It would have been easy, and I'll tell you that we actually did point fingers at each other for a little while before we said, maybe we ought to revisit kind of our assumptions. And we hired somebody to go and investigate what is going on in the market. And lo and behold, we found out that the market we were targeting and had been doing really well at kind of collapsed. Some of those consolidated, some of them shrank. So they were no longer a bigger company that we could sell to and sell more and sell a more sophisticated product. They fell back and were not really fitting into that market segment that we were counting on for growth. It really took us outside of ourselves to go find somebody to go look at it independently.
And I
Yeah.
think the key to that is that, as John described it, is that was motivated by the company to go get outside help. So, in other words, you have to have a disposition to want to actually ask the question: is it a possibility that there might be a better market or a better way of doing things? I was with supercomputer leader Cray Research, and I remember many years ago. I mean, they were in the 80s. They were the number one stock on Nasdaq. And in fact, I think in the entire stock market. And I remember that they built these, $20 million, $50 million supercomputers. And I remember that there was a guy from Berkeley that came in one time and talked to the executive team, talked to all of us about what was going to happen with all these microprocessors. In fact, I remember the title of his presentation was The Attack of the Killer Microprocessor. Now, what he was describing was a upcoming disruptive technology that was going to change the way people did high performance computing. He got laughed out of the room. And because we weren't willing to, as an executive team, we weren't really listening to that. We became so familiar with what we think the right approach is and what we think is the right technology. And we're so in love with our own product that we fail to see how there might be something, a different mindset among a customer. We'd like, well, why would any customer buy that? And there are plenty of reasons why customers would buy that. We just weren't asking that question.
Yeah. So I'd curious, once a business hits that point where growth has stalled, what kinds of decisions do leadership really need to make at that point?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think you got like three choices. The first choice is you can kind of milk your business for what it is, just extract what you can from it. That doesn't necessarily end well, but you're getting the most out of it. And perhaps at this point in time, you're looking for a quick sale before things get any worse. The other is that you can double down, you can try to optimize harder. But usually, as I mentioned earlier, that's going to just have diminishing returns. What John and I help companies do is the third option, which is to help them find new curves to jump to, new growth curves for their business. And that is to reinvent part or all of their business to create a new growth trajectory. And the way we do that is in not to throw out what is currently, working. You can't just, stop a business. We find ways to build a new growth curve within a current structure of a business that helps them grow to a new path. But you really have the choice of just saying, how long do we want to stay in that market, or do we want to find a buyer to exit if you don't jump to a new curve?
Yeah, it's kind of a love it or list it kind of situation to some extent.
Yes, exactly right.
Um, what you make me think of is within our industry, we have multiple things that we've done. Um, Give a general example is, are there additional services that our existing client base can use?
Mhm.
So just recently, like exit strategy, succession exit strategy, um, not only just our clients, but other relationship people that we have. And then there's in particular industries that we've targeted that will require tax and audit the compliance, because
Correct.
compliance has really not been a significant growth area. However, we chose to go into the cannabis space.
Mhm.
Um, and again, most of the time when we do something of that nature, we usually look for an acquisition that's in that space for us to give us at least a general foundation to work from, and then leverage our infrastructure and core skill set to really leverage and implement. Can you talk about, maybe situations where you've worked with clients, kind of going through that process?
Yeah. The M&A example that you shared there, Corey, makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think you started an M&A practice as well that way, correct? Um,
Yes. Yep. We
yeah,
merged one in.
yeah, and
Correct.
that's a beautiful way to get to setting up a structure that supports a new growth curve for your business at large. So it's a beautiful way to do it, notwithstanding all of the issues that come with selecting the right one, all the integration issues and all the rest. But that's another webinar for another time. But that's an attractive approach to do it. One company that I worked with years ago was basically a staff augmentation IT consulting company. And if you're familiar with aug work, it's a race to the bottom for pricing. The business model is a very difficult one to sustain a growth trajectory for. And the S curve on a growth of an IT staff aug company is generally pretty short. Um, Having said that, they've been in business for 25 years at the top of their S curve. I mean, they basically just been bumping along with not a lot of revenue, and they're a few $1 million of revenue. And I met with the CEO, and he goes, "Well, how is it that you? I've had three people come in here and try to help me figure out what to do with this business. How can I know that you're going to be able to figure that out?" And I said, you don't. I mean, the fact of the matter is, you gotta want it, and then you gotta work with somebody, me or somebody else, to kind of look at it. What we ended up doing was we looked at their customer base, and this is a key that because I think a lot of opportunities for growth to a new S curve is already within the customer base you're serving. You just don't have it brought out in it and full attention being made to it in a way that it could be. And so we found in this firm, they were serving three companies, large companies that were life sciences related, biology related companies. And we decided that we were going to take those three companies and spin out an entirely new brand, a new company that was focused just on providing life sciences IT uh, consultation, but not in a staff aug model. We were going to create a whole new model for how that worked. And within 18 months, that business was larger than the parent company. And in fact, I think the parent company is no longer around, but that business is thriving. So there is, I think the key is that you need to look at what you can do to find a new way to maybe even address the needs that you may already be serving, but maybe not serving as fully as you could, and find a way to provide those. And oftentimes they're right there already in your own customer base.
So how do you determine if you're able to, is it conversation with the customer? Is it, I mean, what does that process look like?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that you can do. One of the things that I would start with is taking a look at how you describe your ideal customer profile today. Now, in marketing words, we call that an ICP, but that is to who is it that you're trying to serve? And and this isn't just the firmographic information about how big they are or whatever. It's also the behavioral information about what they're trying to accomplish. And the questions you've got to start asking, I think, to get a handle on this is, you know, are we are we revisiting who we're serving and why? And are we revisiting why they actually buy from us? You know, instead of, are we just coasting on old wins and old formulas to kind of like hope that they repeat that going forward? Or are we out there trying to understand what are the market drivers that really will move the needle? Now, I like to think about this, and the way I describe this is as a bold offer. And to me, a bold offer has two things, two elements to it. One is it creates interest, and it also creates intrigue. And by interest, it satisfies two of the three questions that buyers ask. The three questions that buyers ask is, why should I buy anything? Why should I buy it now? And why should I buy it from you? Now, they may not ask it in that way, but every buyer has to tick those three things off the, right, John? They have to tick those three
Yeah.
things off the list. And if you can create an offer, an offering that has interest, it's because you've tied it to their economic value proposition. They're getting something from it. That creates interest, right? And that creates the, if you can tie it to something, especially if it's a regulatory a requirement, now you're tying it to something that they have to satisfy in order to make it done. So now you've got their interest. But a bold offer doesn't just have to have interest, it has to also have intrigue. Intrigue is the element that is the difference between distinctiveness and sameness. If you got a distinctive offer, and that then you're saying, hey, this is what we can do, and we can do it unlike anybody else. It creates intrigue because they're saying, hey, I want what you got, that's interest, but I'm not sure exactly, I can't believe that you could deliver it that way, or that's so compelling. Can you really do that? That, and of course you need to prove that you can, but if you can create that intrigue, so they're asking the, hey, that's what I want, and how is that possible that you can do that? That creates intrigue. I don't know if you've heard. I've been listening to the internet, Sirius radio when I drive, and I get commercials every once in a while for Bambee HR solutions, and they offer like $20 or $30 a month. You can have a human resources professional that will do everything for you, and it's like, how is it that they can do that? To me, that's intrigue, but it doesn't satisfy the interest part of it. So I'm not going to act because I don't have a need for that personally. But it was like if I did, then maybe I would ask and act, and I would have both interest and intrigue. So a good offer and a good way for moving to that is to think about, what are you offering to your customers today? What could you offer to other customers that might be a subset of the ones that you serve? And maybe there's even another market that you could be looking at that you could even create a better and stronger offer for. But when you do it, make sure you create an offer that's both interesting and intriguing.
But I still come back, how do you identify that? Well, two things. One is, how do you identify that other market? And then the other thing that comes to mind is normally if I'm expanding into a different market, the service or product is already being provided by a competitor or
Mhm.
another party, and there has to be really good reason to change.
Right, exactly right.
One of the things I would say to kind of play off a little bit about what Larry is saying is within an existing organization, you may have expertise that you really don't realize you have because of the base on the basis of serving certain types of customers. So, often you'll have a company has a very broad customer set, but there are some concentrations. And you haven't really been thinking in terms of focusing on a specific vertical or segment of the market. But it turns out that within your organization, between the customers and the people in your organization that have been serving those customers, they actually have some core competencies and expertise and insights that could be the core or the basis for creating that intriguing and defining element. And what you need to decide is, am I going to focus on that? And then how do I turn that into something that's a differentiation to my business? Because it may mean you're going to leave some people behind and there'll be some dissonance within your organization in doing that. But by the same token, you'll create a differentiation that'll allow you to now go really focus on a market that there isn't necessarily differentiation by the competitors. And you're now an expert in a space, and you can go to that place, and the prospects and will see you as being uniquely qualified to meet their needs.
Yeah, you just
I
make me think. Go ahead.
no, well, I was just going to say, John and I work with B2B companies, not B2C. So how you find the markets in B2C companies is probably a lot different than what he and I are both used to working on. To me, there are three things that you want to look for in a market, especially if you're in the B2B setting. One is that you can show they have a high economic need. In other words, there's something that they're willing to part money with, and especially when that's tied to especially when that's tied to something that has some urgency to it. So in other words, they've got money allocated this year because they got to solve this problem. You want that high economic need. The second thing I think you want to look for, and actually there's quite a few that we have in a matrix that we take our clients through, but there are three of these that I think are most important. The high economic need, the size of the market or the segment, and by that I mean the you want to be in a position with whatever market you serve. And by market, I'm not referring to industry necessarily. I'm referring to the group of people that influence one another in a purchase decision. That is a market. And so what you want to look for is being able to have a number one or number two position in that market. So you basically want to be able to set yourself up so that you can grow your business so that you are in the short list of those companies that are being evaluated for a purchase. And then the third, and this I think is really critical, is you want to find markets that have strong network effect. And by that, I mean that there's a lot of cohesion. In other words, there is a high referral frequency. When I was at Cray, when we sold Cray to one of the oil companies, British Petroleum, I think was, might have been Arco. In any case, all of the petroleum companies then started buying them. When we sold their first cray to an automotive company, all the automotive companies started buying them because they all have very high cohesion network effect. They buy from similar suppliers, they buy from similar, they know the different dealers, the whole network among those industries is really, really strong. And when you can find a market that has a really high network effect, especially in a B2B environment where trust is important in a sale, that referral frequency and that referral base that comes with having a strong network effect target in your market is huge. It's absolutely huge. And that's
Yeah,
where you want to build a growth curve.
I two things. One, I'd add just to kind of play on off of what Larry just said. I had an experience when we were selling to electric utilities, which we think are kind of boring and maybe conservative, but the reality is they all know each other because they're basically captive little monopolies. So we
Right.
sell a one,
You
your
got them
game
all.
is everywhere, good or bad. Okay,
Yeah.
but if you're good, it's like knocking over 10 pins, right? The other one is you kind of want to look for markets that are growing as the ones that are shrinking, right? So it may mean that geographically you're in a place that's a good market to be in because just the demographics and the economic trends. Let's pick on Texas. It's easier to be successful perhaps in Texas than it might be like, for example, upstate New York, which isn't necessarily growing, right? So that's part of also you want to consider. I'm using some geographic versions, but there are also certainly industry segments too. Like maybe cannabis is one of those that's a growing space as to some other industries or market segments that you might be looking
Like dye manufacturing.
at. Tool and die makers.
No, I don't mean that. I mean the coloring.
Oh,
That's declining, I think. The food dye manufacturers.
it's at least threatened.
Yes.
Yeah, one of the things that you were talking about a little earlier on core competencies, and again, I'll look within the accounting firm, the accounting industry. I would say that it's hard for us to identify what additional core competencies. It's like we just keep cycling through the same versus identifying, this is really a core competency that you can bring to this marketplace or space. So do you see that normally within industries, or does it come naturally that they identify these and expand it?
Okay, so I maybe take a little bit of a contrarian view. I generally think that companies are too much in love with their own products. And I say that with all respect to the companies that are building it in some ways that they should be in love with their own products. Because if you don't, then there's a problem there that needs to be addressed. But having said that, um, I'm less interested in a company's core competencies than I am in what is a market need. Because, Cory, to your point, you've entered markets where you had no core competencies, but you've acquired them in order for you to satisfy a need that you saw in the market. The problem is if we just look at core competencies, we'll end up constraining ourselves to, basically whoever will buy my stuff. And that could just be a market of mom at the worst
Mhm.
case.
So, if you could leave a business leader with one piece of advice about how to prepare or get through a growth plateau, what would that be?
John, you want to go first?
Yeah, I think one of the things that you need to be doing is you continually reviewing the health of the market you're trying to serve. And I think that's both in terms of how you fit into that space versus your competitors, but it also is really one of the trends of that market space. So if you're selling into large healthcare systems and that's consolidating and continues to consolidate, but at the same time, there's a spin out of lots of little clinics. Maybe you really ought to be trying to think about getting out of being in the big monolithic and looking at maybe some of the smaller clinics that are spinning out. So there's an industry change that's occurring, and you need to be aware of that, and you need to be thinking about what you're going to do to react to that. You might say that I'm going to stay here and I'm just going to ride this all the way through. Or you might say, I'm going to ride this all the way through, but that's really going to be my cash cow to go fund getting into another market segment that leverages my expertise. But the point is, I need to be highly aware of what's going on and not just rely on your own internal team's thinking and opinions.
Yeah, so I would second that. I mean, I think uh, you're onto the right thing. It's the attitude of being inquisitive. And if an owner of a business looks at their business from a perspective of uh, like Andrew Grove used to say, only the paranoid survive. You know, you need to be kind of a little bit self-paranoid about what's going on in the market and what needs to be going on in your business in order for you to survive. So I think that idea of having that relentless inquisitiveness that doesn't like hold your product, your way of delivering more dear than the customer does. You know, the measure of the rightness of something is not on how good you feel about it, it's on how good a customer perceives it to be. I remember I had a CEO one time, and we were talking about his software product, and he stopped me and he says, he was the founder of this company. He says, "Larry, I just want you to tell me that my baby is pretty." I said, "You don't want me to tell you your baby's pretty. I mean, maybe you do, but my voice doesn't matter because I'm not buying your baby. What you need to do is, check the voices of those that are." So John's point, to me, I roll up and just say, if you've got an inquisitive mindset that's open to always looking at that, that's key. And the thing that I would add to that is not to wait until you're forced to change. Because we're used to optimizing our businesses, we will optimize it into summit blindness and not be able to see that we're at the top. And so the best time to think about reinventing is actually when things are still good, but you're always monitoring to say, is this a good time for us to figure out whether we need to be jumping or testing, whether there's a new appetite for a market out there? So if you keep a scientific mind to running your business and treat it like it's an experiment that it has so many dynamic variables that it's always going to be changing, knowing that it's not a production machine that's always going to live. It's very dynamic. It's not static.
Yeah, can you give me an idea of kind of the just a high level kind of the process that you go through and who participates in that process?
Yeah. So when we go through our work with a client, we ask a lot of questions. We go through basically a big discovery process, and we try to understand. Now, John and I, we are revenue engine experts. We're not production people. We're not, technologists. We're not all of that. What we look at is what does it take to win in the market, and how do we make that win successful in our business? So that's what we evaluate first. We look at where's a company doing that today? How is that working for them? Where are some of the challenges? And we spend about 2 or 3 months looking at that piece of it, and we put together then some recommendations that they can specifically take to improve their sales operations today. Now, when a company decides to do the transformational change that John and I are talking about, this isn't something that you just pull off in a couple months. This is something that you work on, and it might take months or years to actually implement, depending on how big the change is. And so we like to try to create some initial wins by, well, here's some things that you can do, little tweaks you can make, knowing that you still have to do the transformation. And then we work through a process of really defining, all right, we look at different market segments. We look at what are the attributes that we could have. And then we dive in and look at what are the behavioral characteristics in those markets? Where are the highest degree pain points? How might we create a new offering, the one that we don't even have today? Or how could we use what we have today to seed it into a market? When I worked with one company, I found that they were not there. They had a very, very cool tool for organizing and managing some of the IT practices inside of a Fortune 100 company, very big companies, but they couldn't get anybody to buy this product. And it turns out nobody was looking for it on the internet. After I conducted a number of focus groups, I found out nobody was looking for it on the internet, even though they loved the product when I showed it to them. But they weren't looking for it because they didn't actually think the problem could be solved. But what they were looking for was one piece of the product that they already had developed. So we basically changed the lead offering of that product to be the go to market. And that then opened up an opportunity for them to sell more.
Well, I just say that we have a process. It typically takes several months. The end result is a blueprint for our clients to then have a new strategy for how they're going to transform the business. And they can take that blueprint and run with it themselves, or they can have us come in and help them basically guide them through that exercise. But
Yeah, that's
it's
right.
like
Thanks.
Larry said, it's typically a 12 to 18-month cycle, maybe even longer, depending on kind of the complexity of what they're dealing with, to get that rooted and yielding the new growth curve.
The other approach that we take, Cory, just if I can for a second, is that we are very much about getting market insights from the market. So we don't spend a lot of time up front doing a ton of research to try to button down every unanswered question. We try to get to the 80% solution and then bring that to a way that we can introduce it to the market to get real market dynamic feedback and then make those adjustments as we go.
Yeah, you're just it's very data driven is what I'm really hearing.
Mm-hmm.
We
And
try to
iterative.
get it's iterative, and we look for information that is external of the company. So while we do internal analysis, our bias is what does the customer think more than what do we think?
So does it involves inquiry or feedback from the customer?
Yes. Yeah, we
And
generally
prospect.
work, yeah, customers and prospects. Yeah, we
And
generally tap into what we know about them today, and then we use that to frame up what the inferences and assumptions are and how we want to go to market to understand what their driver needs are.
and the participants from the company that we work with is senior leadership. So it's certainly going to be the senior executive, CEO, general manager, whatever the corporate structure is. And very likely it's going to involve, if there's product people, some senior product representation, ops people to the extent that they're ops people that are going to have to ultimately execute a strategy, sales, marketing. Often, if it's a company that has a strong marketing component to their demand generation or sort of customer engagement, it may even get down to the point where we're going to guide them towards rebuilding their website, come up with new branding. I mean, there's kind of a range of things, but we need those people to be involved as part of both the discovery and then the formulation of the new strategy.
Yeah, and I know for us, just you make me think of if we decided to offer a new service. However, it would have been a lot easier just to offer the new service to non-existing clients because they had certain levels of expectations, which would then drag us to do a lot more of the work behind than if it's a new customer, because it was kind of an annual renewal service.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that, business wise, one, it was the service offering to existing clients was going to be a lot more painful, a lot more time consuming, versus if we just did it outside to non-existing clients, it was going to be a smoother. So
Yeah. Yeah, there's something to be said about that. You've conditioned your clients to expect a certain level of service at a certain price. And sometimes it's very difficult to get away from that. And there are strategies to do that, but oftentimes to validate whether the service is worthwhile or not, starting with a fresh market that doesn't have those biases or conditioning from you can be really helpful as well. The other thing too, by the way, that makes that even more attractive, Corey, is that you're validating it not based on their loyalty to you, but based on their need for the product.
Correct. Yep, that's correct. Well, we're nearing the top of the hour, and I notice there are not any questions in the queue right now. But
We did a
Larry
great job then.
and John, yeah, great thought-provoking
Yeah, no questions.
conversation here. And every company revenue is key. Great operations obviously needs to be in place and support that efficiency gains and so forth, but continually to have growth and then new innovative lines is so important for all organizations.
Yeah,
Because I've not seen too many organizations that advancement of technology, new products doesn't remove. I mean, who would ever thought that the buggy whip would have went away, or
right.
I
Or
was
As Henry Ford said, if I asked the market, they said they wanted faster horses. So they, you know,
yeah. Yeah, and
so
at one point I was involved or I had a client that was a video store that got replaced by Netflix. So
mhm,
that
right.
is replaced by Amazon online. So
Yep.
just a continuous evolution of
Well,
all services
eh,
and products.
yeah, and most growth curves aren't because the company is threatened to go away entirely, like the industries you're describing. It's because they've grown to a certain point, and to continue to grow, they need to find a new mechanism to get them there. It isn't that they're necessarily going to die. They may not have the same profitability that they once had when they were at the peak of their growth curve, but getting them to a new growth curve is to keep that growth momentum going. It isn't to necessarily stave off extinction, except for the
Yeah,
case of video
yeah,
stores.
yeah, but I guess I would say, and again, my client had an opportunity to invest in Netflix. Netflix has an opportunity to advance and to
I
continuously look
miss that. Yeah.
to evolve
Yeah.
with the world as it
Yes.
evolves. And
Yep.
again, every organization, yes, maybe it's not distinct, but like you said, there's erosion of margin, there's erosion of
Correct.
market
Yep.
share, and so forth. Which for many of us, including myself, I mean, this is part of my retirement asset, and to get something that continuously grows and thrives is so important.
Critical. Yeah, absolutely. For most business owners, this is the largest, their business is the largest piece of their retirement asset. So it's
Yep.
important. It's a very important issue to work on.
Yep. Well, thank you again for your time this afternoon. Great subject. And again, for the listeners, we'll be sending out the this recording as well as contact information if you are interested to have any follow up with Larry and John. They'll be more than willing to talk to you about it. So again, everyone have a great rest of the week, and a great webinar, guys.
Thank you, Corey.
Thanks.
And to all those that
All right.
were on this webinar, just want to say you guys are the Navy SEALs of hanging with this for it, because paying attention to this isn't something that naturally comes to mind. So it's great. Glad to be part of it. Thanks, Corey.
Yep.